Well, for those who were at last week's service, you'll know that we've started a new series on John, the Gospel of John. And as we're starting to find out, John is different from the other three Gospels. It just is. It's packed full of theology. And the sole purpose of why John wrote this Gospel is that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So everything John does is written around that. And as I shared last week also, that we'll be looking at a different chapter each week, and there's so much in those chapters that it would be impossible to cover everything that's there. So what I will continue to encourage you to do is that you would go home and read the entire chapter during the week and soak yourself in it. Meditate on the Word and allow Christ to reveal more of himself to you while doing that. See this as an opportunity to follow him through this book as we read, and to identify with the disciples as their knowledge of him continue to expand. And this, you can see this clearly in the second chapter, which is what we're about to look at. So let's pray first. Lord, may the words from this chapter that we're looking at in John, I ask, Lord, that really touch our hearts. The disciples, as they travelled with you, each time something happened, they believed. They saw who you really were and they believed. And I ask, Lord, that will be the same for us as well as we read through this. I ask this in your name. Amen. So the start of this chapter recounts the time when Jesus turned water into wine, as Jaden read earlier on in the service at a wedding. And this is one of the first signs, public signs, that was recorded that what Jesus did. It was a demonstration of his glory, revealing it for the first time. And in verse 11, it says, this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So now if we're reading from verse 13, and the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Then his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has eaten me up. So the Jews answered and said to him, what sign do you show to us, since you do these things? Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in just 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. It's also interesting to note that at the end of this passage, in verse 22, John highlighted this. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. So each time John's mentioning his story and recording it, he's pointing out this is not just for the reader's benefits, but the disciples. Each time they saw, they witnessed, they were part of something, it was another reason for them to believe that Jesus was who he was. As I said, John is different from the other Gospels. It appears that, if you're looking at it in an objective mind, that this time when he drives out the merchants and that is not the same as in the other three Gospels. And I'll point it out. This happened at the start of Jesus' ministry, whereas on the other three Gospels, it happened at the end of his ministry. as he was coming into Jerusalem for the last time. The language and the intensity of the anger that Jesus displays is different. So it's possible that this actually happened twice, 2 Passovers apart in his ministry. I think the other thing that stands out is the reaction of the Pharisees in the temple. In the other 3 accounts in the Gospels, they were enraged, absolutely enraged, which caused them to go and act decisively quickly, which was to bring charges up against Jesus. Whereas John's account, they were like, "Who are you? Show us a sign." They had no idea. So yes, it is possible that Jesus did this more than once. And each time he did it, the anger grew with him about what was happening in his Father's house. So what can we learn from this? In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep, pigeons, and the money changers were sitting there. So what was happening was inside the temple court, a place that was meant for prayer, there were sellers sitting around with these animals waiting to make a transaction. And there are other ones who were there wanting to exchange their money from the Roman coins to temple shekels, so that they could then go and buy the animals. And seeing this, Jesus got angry, as we know, and he said, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." He does not say that the sellers and money changers are robbers, like in other passages. He doesn't say that the animals are defective. He doesn't even say that it's a place of prayer, which it is. But what he says is they've turned his Father's house into a market, a bazaar. Try to put yourself in the temple on the day. And instead of entering a place of worship where there's peace and calm, there's noisy merchants bargaining, shouting out, "Buy this, buy that." Having recently been in the Middle East and having dealt with traders and merchants inside and outside of the church, I can tell you it's not fun. And it definitely does not draw you towards God in any way, shape or form. We actually visited, whenever something happens, they put a church there. So on this rock for Peter, there's a church. Where Jesus turned water into wine, there's a church. So we actually went to this church which signified supposedly where this wedding happened. And outside the church, directly outside, it's lined with shops saying, "Buy our wine that's got turned from water," which is where Jesus did this. That's amazing. Not fun at all, and it definitely does not draw you towards God. So it was noisy, a lot happening. And the other thing that the people had to do was swap the money over, because they all used Roman coins to do their shopping, their normal day-to-day business. But on the coins was an effigy of the emperor. And so, as far as the chief priests were concerned, you could not offer or buy anything from inside the temple with the emperor's effigy on the coin. So then it had to be changed over into temple shekels, which they were very willing to do for a price, to swap it over so that you could then buy their stuff. All this really meant was, instead of having a focus on worship and prayer, it was now a money-making exercise. It was a business. And for those who travelled great distance, who didn't have anything to sacrifice them, they were there to serve and sell and help them out in any way, shape or possible. Jesus was angry. This is my Father's house, not yours. This is my Father's house, and how dare you let this happen? Here's what I'm thinking though. Those traders, of sheep and cattle, etc. Those money changers, they weren't there as a charity. They were there to make money. It's basic business sense, supply and demand. If people weren't willing to buy the animals, if people weren't willing to change the shekels, they wouldn't be there. There would be no need for that. And I think it showed a pattern of Israel of the day, where they started to take the easy way out. They had been asked by God, whenever you go, whenever you sacrifice, you take your best. You take your first fruit. You take your best lamb. Take it to the temple and sacrifice it. But instead, they go, that is hard. That's too hard. That's too big a sacrifice. It'd be much easier. We'll just buy what they've got there. Sacrifice that, and then all be sweet. Can you see the shift from what they should have been doing? If they were being obedient to God, and if they were willing to sacrifice what God was asking them to sacrifice, there'd be no need for the money changes. There'd be no need for all these traders in the temple, because the people would have been obedient to God. And that's the thing that stands out for me. They stopped being obedient to what God was requiring of them. And I must admit, in today's day and age, living where we are, we live a very comfortable life, don't we? It's very easy to go to church and sit here for an hour and a half, depending on how I speak. It's very easy to just do what we do and then go back into life. There's not much sacrifice, is there? Or so it seems. I heard a story about a lady visiting from a war-torn African country where she's a believer. And she visited America. And she wandered around and went to churches and did speaking tours and things like that. She said afterwards, I don't think I could have the faith if I lived in America. I don't think I could do it. Where I live, I rely on God for absolutely everything, including my life. I have to trust in everything. My faith has to be strong to survive. And yet here, which is saying in America, you guys have it so easy. Everything's there on the plate for you. What are you looking to God for? Dan Zelli shared a couple of weeks ago how he saw God work when he was overseas in Cambodia and Vietnam and things like that. And how he could testify how often he had to rely on God, how his faith was put to the test, and how he'd seen God come through in so many ways, not just in his own life, but in people's lives all throughout the country. The worshippers in that temple, when Jesus was there, disobeyed God. They took the easy way out. And I think today, many today want spirituality without sacrifice. I think today people are wanting to know, what plan should I do? What mobile app should I use? Which book should I read? Which mega pastor should I follow so that they can achieve what they believe is the level of spirituality that they are comfortable with, not what God requires of us. What do we have to sacrifice? If God's asking us to sacrifice, what does he mean? Is he saying we should give more on the collection? Do we need to volunteer extra time at community kitchen? Do we need to give myself a pay rise so that I can speak better? If you think so, then you're missing the point altogether. God's blessing through us will not flow unless we are willing to do the hard work. I heard a pastor say this: most people are looking for a Macca's religion. They want it created their way. If you want to be real about your faith, then we must remember God must be first in everything that we do. He requires our firstborn, our first fruit, our first time, our first efforts. God must be first in everything that we do. And once we do that, genuine obedience and sacrifice, that will then bring out real faith as well. When the Israelites obeyed what was required, when they did give their first fruit, when they did give their first lambs, that actually put them at a disadvantage to all their neighbours around, the Gentiles. Because the Gentiles obviously hoarded all that they could so that they could have better crops and better food and better herds of animals. But when the Israelites gave away their best to God, and when God blessed them, which they did, which they were, then they could say very clearly, God supplied all my needs. They knew who to praise and honour. Why did Jesus clear the temple? He was upset that nothing in his Father's house was honouring God. Nothing was honouring God. Instead of giving what they required, they kept it for themselves. As most of you know, in the next 3 to 6 months or so, this church will receive nearly $750,000 from the sale of a portion of our land. And I've been talking with various other pastors and consultants when looking to prepare for this and what to do. And the common theme amongst everybody is that money can be a blessing or a curse to this fellowship. And it's much easier for it to be a curse than a blessing. I heard a story of some young fellas up at Burke who was brought under the wing of a guy. And these young guys, they were musicians, they were budding musicians, wanted to go out and travel and do whatever they had to do. So this guy pulled them all together and got them work in the various cotton farms. And they did chipping and they did weeding and they did whatever was required. But it was summer and it was hot. But they still did it so that they had enough money to purchase a van. And then they kept working to do up that van so that they could then go around and do gigs in towns around the place. The guy who was heading it up said the hardest thing for him to do was to say no to the government. Because the government wanted to give them a brand new van. The government wanted to give them money to do this and do that. And he said, if we just bought a brand new van, what's that going to mean to the guys? They put nothing into it. They don't own it. They don't own what they have done. It was much better for them to work and achieve something than have stuff just given to them. There was a church that I heard about, a small church, and they heard about, you'll recognise this story, you heard about needs in India. They couldn't do much. But they chose to anyway step out in obedience and sacrifice time and effort and Saturdays and all sorts of things like that to give to these projects in India. And the blessings from that was immense. It brought the church together. It brought the people together. It gave them a common purpose so that God would be glorified in all that they did. If they just had the cash and gave it, would not have had the same impact on the fellowship. God would not have been able to work through that church. And I'm talking about you guys. From what I've heard and what I've seen, just from that willingness to get to the sewing project for Bunnings Barbecues, which is coming up on the 17th of December. Make sure you are available for that.
No plug here.
But you can see firsthand how God has done amazing things because your willingness to be obedient to what He required and your willingness to sacrifice time and energy and everything else. My concern is, once we get this money, that will take a step back. It'll become easy because we've got that money anyway, so we'll just give it for this and we'll just give it for that. We'll give it for this. Where's the faith part in that? Where is the ownership in that? Where is God in all of that? And that's what I don't want to see happening in our fellowship. I so hope that we won't end up like the Israelites with a shallow faith because of how God has blessed us. I so hope that we will never, ever be more focused on self than giving God the glory He so richly deserves. And I don't think it will happen. I really don't. Because we're willing to recognise it. We're willing to see that this is a possibility. So we'll take definitive steps to make sure that hopefully that will never happen. God is speaking to us about this. I really firmly believe this. Why are so many churches closing down? They become stagnant, become irrelevant. There's infighting. There's negativity within the fellowship. They've lost the joy. Why? Maybe it's because they've allowed traders and money changers into their church and into their midst. Romans 12, take your everyday ordinary life of sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing that you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. We need to choose today to put God first in everything. Be willing to be obedient in all that we are asked to do. And be willing to sacrifice whatever is required. No matter what the outcome is, that's what we need to do. So that God will receive the glory and the honour He so richly deserves in everything.